Hey,
Hey, what's what are you wearing?
you know there's an old saying, you know it, I know it, we all know it. The bigger the shoulders, the stronger the man.
Pretty sure. Yeah, that's not a thing. Just when you think they've done it all, Games Workshop has one-upped themselves yet again in the never-ending race to make bigger, weirder, and more over-the-top Space Marines. The new Horus Heresy edition is upon us, and with it, the new Saturnine Terminators. Apparently, a long time ago, there was a metal model of one of these, and I just kind of thought that was a meme that somebody made, but apparently it was a real thing. And you know what? I'm not afraid to say it. I personally enjoy painting Space Marines. The basic geometric shapes and defined edges are really satisfying to paint. And today, I'm going to share my favorite way to get Space Marines looking good. And this Saturnine Praetor is a great model to showcase this approach with because he's got so much damn detail and it's really easy to get overwhelmed. But by keeping our approach straightforward and digestible, we can knock out any Space Marine or heck, any armored model at all for that matter. And when I say this model had a lot of detail, I'm not bullshitting you. It has 78 pieces on the sprue just for this one model. So there were a lot of opportunities for you to customize the pose of this model because it came in so many parts, but it was an effort in and of itself to build it. He's also freaking huge. Like, take a look at him compared to the newer 40K Terminators. Hell, look at him compared to a 30K Primarch model. Why is he so big? I thought the Primarchs were supposed to be the biggest boys, and bigger the size, the more power, but what do I know? Now I'm going to paint this guy up as a Space Wolf, and I did a little bit of research to figure out how the color scheme for Space Wolves in the Horus Heresy era differ from that in the 40K era. It seems they're more of a stormy gray color with just that hint of bluish gray towards the highlights, as opposed to having that blue-gray really shine through the entire armor color. It is going to be a bit tricky to make these guys read as Space Wolves without that bluish gray as a foundation, but color choice is always something that we can fix later if we screw it up at the beginning. That's totally not foreshadowing. I start with a dark, dirty gray and Skaven Blight Dinge and go forward with my chaotic, scratchy plan of attack. I thin the paint with a touch of water so it flows well and doesn't give me full opacity. And instead of base coating all of this crazy detailed armor, I just define the shapes and scratch out where the light would hit the armor based on the angle of above and to the model's left. Can you guys hear my dog snoring? He's trying to be quiet. But he's right over there. He's usually very well behaved when I'm recording for videos, but when he falls asleep, he snores very loud. It's not his fault. By painting with scratchy lines directly over a black primer, we're setting ourselves up with a foundation with a grim dark feel. And because our paint is still somewhat transparent, no single scratchy brushstroke is going to make or break our entire paint job, so I don't worry about making too many mistakes here. The darker regions are left mostly untouched to build the drama of shadows. And as we move on to our second color, Storm Vermin Fur, we build up the layers of the scratches on top of each other to amplify the beaten and weathered appearance into a much easier form of blending. Each brushstroke builds off of those below it, and each scratchy line gives much more dimension to the shapes on the model. All the while, this being much more laid back and much more fun than making sure you base coat in the lines on every single piece of your model. You do want to make sure that you let your brush skim over each edge to define it, and then follow the shape of each surface with your scratches to highlight up its volumes. Understanding volumes and how to paint them is, in my opinion, the single most important factor in miniature painting. And there's some great, simple online resources out there showing how light hits certain shapes, and then you can replicate that in your painting. And I know it may sound like I'm assigning homework to you right now, but don't look at it that way. Think about it this way. These are references that you can look at while you're painting to give yourself more confidence as you go through the paint job. Honestly, the topic of painting volumes deserves a video all its own, and I will make that video if that's something you want to see. But for now, let's ask ourselves this. Does this paint job look like a Space Wolf? Honestly, I do not think it does. I thought these dirty grays would give us more color depth, but it just kind of looks like a black and white picture to me right now. So in order to try to remedy this, I'm going to add another highlight, this time adding in a pale blue to the mix to give us more of that cold color in the highlights. And while this is giving us more drama through brighter highlights, we still aren't where I want to be. So, did I screw up my initial color choices for this armor? Yes, I did. But that does not mean we're going to start over. I do not start over. We don't reprime. We don't strip the model. We learn as we go, and we learn how to fix and adjust our mistakes. Nothing is beyond saving. And the more we realize we can always right the ship, the more comfortable we get with jumping headfirst into a project without having to figure out all the details of that project before we even begin. First attempt was some Seraphim Sepia and some Drakenhof Nightshade washes on the armor to try to bring in that blue and a little bit of warmth in the highlight to keep that storm gray color. This didn't really help us at all. But instead of getting frustrated with this, I am going to move on to a separate section of the model that's equally important, that will help us frame this armor so we can come back and fix it later. All of the pale gold trim is a key color to this armor, so I'm going to knock that out right now. And I'm trying out these new pure metallics from P3 for this, and holy hell, these things are really nice. I'm able to base coat all the trim in one easy coat with full opacity, which is pretty impressive. And this gold is looking extremely shiny right now, which is exactly what I want. You see, it's much easier to bring depth and realism to metallics by starting bright and then layering on darker tones over the top. And for that, I'll use some Gargarak Sewer Contrast Paint, thinned with a bit of water, to give us a nasty grime in the recesses. I move my brush around so the wash settles in all the cracks and crevices and around small details like rivets. We'll get a general dulling of the metallics all over the surface with this step as well, but just make sure that we don't have pooling in any of the raised areas. To really sell this effect, I go back in with a second undiluted layer and just touch those darkest regions around the rivets and in the corners. This will really cut away the shine and show that grime, so there's a lot more dimension to the gold. One thing I dislike about using true metallic paint is the lack of color contrast that we tend to have in our paint jobs when we use it. Just a metallic in a wash doesn't give us that real world depth, which is why I like to come back in with a fun color. Like for gold, I'll use Stegadon Scale Green, thinned down with equal parts water to build in a decay with an interesting color. And even if you want bright, shiny metallics, using a contrasting color in the shadows will bring a lot more depth while still looking like shiny metal. And from here, we can come back into that most satisfying step of metallics, of bringing back our brightest shine with our pure pale gold again. This stuff really pops now that we've cut back on the shine across most of the trim. And we don't even have to go to a brighter gold to get this effect. It's just the same one that we base coated with. Today's video is brought to us by the makers of the glasses that I wear every day, Pair Eyewear. They also make my prescription sunglasses. Ha! It's the same glasses. And that's because they use these thin, durable, magnetic top frames so you can change the look of your glasses whenever you want without having to own 40 pairs. Buying and finding the perfect pair of glasses for your face shape has never been easier. I know I'm never going to do it any other way. They have thousands of amazing top frame designs with new and limited edition ones dropping all the time. Oh, and did I mention that they're a fraction of the price of glasses that you buy in stores? High quality, low prices, easy to order, and more styles than you'll find anywhere else. If all of those aren't reasons enough to try Pair Eyewear, how about guilt? Pair donates a pair of glasses to a child in need for every pair they sell. Do you want kids fumbling around in a blurry world? What kind of monster are you? As a final nudge to get you to try Pair Eyewear, they are offering 15% off to Ninjon viewers. Just use the QR code on your screen or the link in the description below and use code NINJON15 at checkout for 15% off. Thanks, Pair. Now let's get back to the video. And now that we've achieved a small victory and are feeling good about ourselves, it's time to go back to the armor itself and see if we can make this look more like a Space Wolf and not like a goddamn Iron Hands model. The first thing I'm going to do is push the highlights up another notch with the same two colors I used to highlight before, but this time I'm adding much more of the pale blue into the mix. This is going to accomplish two things. First, we are going to punch up those armor tones so it's not drowned out by the shiny gold. The second thing, and probably more importantly, is it's really pushing that blue to the forefront right now so we can see that as a true tone of the armor. And this is definitely putting us in the right direction, but we still have the problem of our midtones not feeling quite blue enough. The disconnect is too great between highlight and midtone. But we're definitely not going to repaint all of those midtones. We spent all that time, and this can easily be salvaged. What I'm going to do is thin down the Fang, a color that I probably should have started with at the beginning of this paint job, and swipe a thin coat over all of those scratches to give them a slightly colder tone. I think we're there. Maybe. Kind of. It took a while, but that's fine. That's miniature painting. You're never going to know all the answers every time you start a paint job, and just working your way through it sometimes is half the battle, and you get much more satisfied when you do finally get to the conclusion. Unfortunately, the model is not entirely completed at this point, so let's move on to some other important details. One way I've found to speed up my painting is to get these details done quickly and pretty straightforward. They aren't the focus, so what are the fewest steps I can take to make them look good? I continue with my scratchy line mentality, so no surface of this model looks perfectly pristine. This builds in a level of interest to the model while we're just slapping paint around. I then jump right into highlighting the edges and creases, throwing a few more thin scratches and dots in there to give us that weathered look. You know, we're told that painting a very light color like the cream cloth we're about to do directly over black primer is a terrible idea, but you know what? I found that not to be true, and it's actually kind of fun. The trick is to have just a bit of patience with your scratchy lines. No single brush stroke is going to cover that black entirely, so we let a few layers of these scratches build up the depth over the areas that would catch more light. And the darker areas with only 1 or 2 layers of scratches will show more of that black through, creating the depth of shadow we're looking for. Painting in this way is also great for an impatient painter like me. I never actually stop painting. I'm just moving the brush around with those tiny scratches, and by the time I go back to the section that I had one layer on, it's already dried because I'm using thin little lines. As a rule of thumb, whenever I have multiple kinds of metallic paints on a model, I let one of those metallics shine and be the focus, and the other ones are going to be a bit more subdued. And that's exactly what I'm doing here with this dark steel. It's just a simple base coat with a wash of black Templar to add some depth to the shadows. And then, after touching up some of the edges with a bit of a brighter steel, I again add depth to our metallics with the old tried and true Doom Bull Brown. I thin this stuff down just like I did with the Stegadon Scale Green for the gold and let it touch into the recesses and around areas where rust would accumulate. In fact, this stuff looks so good here, I'm actually adding it on the bluish armor as well. Again, being very constrained, a little bit can go a long ways. I do not want to overdo all the weathering on this model and kind of cover all the cool work we've done thus far. All right, let's finish this guy off with a couple of cool effects. The first one being glowing plasma coils and lenses. And for that, I always start with 2 to 3 thin coats of pure white over whatever I want to glow. After that, I put some Pilar Glacier contrast paint over the top. Sounds like a delicious stick of gum. Tried the new Pilar Glacier? Fresh mint. But honestly, this stuff was a bit too weak for my liking, so I went back to my tried and true golden high flow fluorescent paints. This stuff is my favorite fluorescence on the market, and the blue is going to give us that nice vibrant punch we're looking for. Now, there's certainly more complex ways to achieve a more realistic glow, but I just sometimes want to knock this out fast and have it eye-catching. The last step that I do is go back to that pure white and just dot the lenses and the top points of the coils to make them feel like they're glowing hot. Then for a bit of blood splatter on our Praetor's axe, I just use whatever blood effects paint I have nearby and a sponge that I rip off and dab it directly onto the model. This gives us a realistic splatter that isn't uniform, which is a key point here. Just be sure to gently touch the model with the sponge or you'll cover the entire blade by accident. I like to hold the sponge with the tweezers to get a bit more control with this step. Finally, the base. What a great excuse to bust out that big old brush you have and do some wet blending practice directly on the base of the model. I start with the darker color near the feet of the model and then blend that right on the base with a brighter scrag brown. For rocks and masonry, I prefer to use an old synthetic brush and jab, scratch, and prod at the stones rather than use a dry brush. This is not quite as fast, but it still does not take much time at all and looks much more realistic. I typically end with a fairly bright color like Carrick stone on the edges of the rocks and mix a bit of that into our scrag brown to dot the tops of the soil. This way, when I come back through with a uniform brown wash over the entire base, the cool details of the base still show through. And with that, the biggest, most detailed, probably most badass, certainly silliest looking Space Marine I've ever painted is complete. And looking at him right now, he looks complicated and overwhelming to paint, but honestly, he wasn't, just because we were able to break it out into bite-sized chunks and just knock those out piece by piece. And that's my takeaway from this paint job today. No matter how complex the model, whether it's a Space Marine or anything else, as long as you break it into digestible chunks, you can knock it out and it doesn't need to take that long. Other than the assembly process, 78 pieces. That takes a long time. And while I started feeling pretty unsure about the massive silly shoulder pads of these Saturn IX Terminators, I think they are actually pretty damn intimidating. He is a cool space wolf. And you know what? He didn't start out looking like a space wolf. And that's another big takeaway here today, is that there is no mistake that we make that we can't fix later. It's part of the learning process. You are going to become a better painter by making those mistakes and actually working through them, much more than if you just always want to restart. Thanks for hanging out today. Thanks to Games Workshop for sending me this Horus Heresy box. The models inside are plentiful and pretty badass. It would be a shame if that giant dreadnought in here were to fall into the hands of my Mad Max orcs. I know they're not 30K, but I'm going to be back next week with another new video. Can't wait to see you then. But just make sure that between now and then, you find time in your day to slay the gray.
Yeah, you know what they say. The bigger the shoulders, the stronger the man.